In the remote stretches of Chiapas, Mexico, where the dense Mayan jungle swallows light and sound, there was a family whose name carried both respect and sorrow: the Huipas. They were not wealthy. They owned no grand estates, no herds of cattle. Their treasure was their unity, a tight-knit clan of farmers and hunters who lived off the land, shared every meal, and stood shoulder to shoulder against whatever life hurled their way. Among them were 4 cousins: Mateo, Isandro, Lucas, and Yari, boys born just a few years apart, who grew up more like brothers than cousins. They worked side by side in the cornfields under the burning sun, hunted iguanas and wild turkeys in the forest, and told each other dreams around the evening fire. Their bond was unbreakable, the kind of loyalty only forged when you share both bread and hunger. But in a single night, everything changed. It was late in the rainy season when the sound of shouts and boots echoed through the Huipa land. A dispute over a strip of fertile farmland had been simmering for years between their family and a group of men from a neighboring town. That night, the argument boiled over. The cousins' uncle Don Aurelio, a man they all admired for his wisdom and strength, confronted the intruders. The fight was short and brutal. Armed with machetes and clubs, the attackers struck him down. By the time the cousins rushed to the scene, Don Aurelio lay bleeding in the mud, his breath shallow, his eyes glassy but still searching for them. They carried him home, their young hands trembling, their hearts pounding. For 3 days he lingered, whispering blessings and unfinished stories, until the breath left his body for good. The grief was unbearable, but what came next cut even deeper. Everyone in the village knew who had done it. There were witnesses. Yet when the family went to the police, they were met with indifference and then silence. Bribes had been paid, deals struck in the shadows. The killers laughed openly in the marketplace, drinking, boasting about teaching the Huipas a lesson. For the 4 cousins, this wasn't just the loss of an uncle. It was the destruction of their world's moral order. The idea that right would triumph over wrong, that if you waited, justice would come died along with Don Aurelio. In its place, something darker began to grow. They didn't speak of revenge at first. It was just a shared heaviness in their eyes, a lingering anger in their voices. When they worked the fields, their machetes struck the soil with a little more force. When they hunted, they moved with the silent patience of predators. The forest, once a place of childhood games, began to feel like a training ground. Years passed, but the pain did not fade. The Huipas' cousins watched the men who had killed their uncle prosper, gaining more land, more influence, as if cruelty had been rewarded. They listened to the whispers of neighbors. That's just how things are here. Best to let it go before you end up the same way. But the cousins were not made for surrender. What bound them now was more than blood. It was a pact, unspoken but powerful, that someday they would make things right in their own way. They would not involve the law. They would not seek help from those who had turned their backs. The Huipas would handle their pain the way their ancestors had handled threats for generations, with cunning, with patience, and with the certainty that those who had taken from them would pay. And so the boys became men. Each learned a skill the others could use. Mateo, the eldest, was a master tracker, able to follow the faintest trail through thick jungle. Isandro had a silver tongue, able to win trust with his easy smile. Lucas was strong and quiet, the one who could carry the heaviest loads without complaint. And Yari, the youngest, had the sharpest instincts, quick to sense danger, quicker to see opportunity. The world knew them only as humble Mayan farmers. But beneath the surface, something was taking shape, a storm gathering in the silence. A family bound not just by love, but by a shared wound that had never healed. The Huipas were no longer just cousins. They were a single heartbeat, each pulse carrying the same rhythm. Remember what they did, remember who we are. Justice is the anchor that holds a community together. Without it, fear and bitterness replace trust. For the Huipas, that anchor snapped the night Don Aurelio died, and the way the world responded afterward lit a fire in 4 young hearts that would never be extinguished. In the days following the attack, grief filled the Huipa home like heavy smoke. Relatives gathered to mourn, neighbors brought food, and the cousins sat in a stunned silence. They expected the law to act. They expected the police to arrive, take statements, arrest the men everyone knew were guilty. But as days turned into a week, it became painfully clear no one was coming. Mateo, the eldest cousin, was the first to walk to the town police station, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. The officer behind the desk barely looked up from his paperwork. "We'll investigate," he said flatly. No questions, no urgency, just a meaningless promise. 2 days later, Isandro saw something that made his stomach twist. The very same officer drinking at a cantina with one of the killers. They were laughing, slapping each other on the back like old friends. Word spread quickly the attackers had paid the police to forget the case. Some said it was cash, others claimed it was land. Whatever it was, it had worked. The message was clear: the Huipas were on their own. For the cousins, this was more than just a legal failure. It was a betrayal of the unspoken rules of life in their community. The idea that you could commit such an act and walk away untouched was like a sickness infecting the village. Fear replaced outrage. People lowered their eyes when the killers passed. No one wanted to become the next target. Lucas, the quietest of the four, started keeping track. He noticed how the killers flaunted their freedom. They rode new horses, wore new boots, bought expensive liquor. They spoke loudly about their victory in the marketplace. Sometimes they would stare down the Huipas from across the street, a smirk playing on their lips. Yari, the youngest cousin, was still a teenager at the time. He struggled to understand how the world could be so crooked. If no one stops them, he asked one night by the fire, what's to keep them from doing it again? No one answered, but the silence itself was an answer nothing. As the months passed, the injustice became a living thing. It was there when they harvested corn, when they hunted deer, when they knelt to pray. It lived in their thoughts like a parasite, feeding on their anger. The law had turned its back, and so had many in the village. The Huipas had been marked as victims not just of violence, but of a system designed to protect the powerful. Then came the final insult. One afternoon, the killers began clearing a piece of land that had once belonged to Don Aurelio, the very land he had died defending. The cousins stood at the edge of the field, watching the trees fall, one by one. Each strike of the axe was like a drumbeat of humiliation. It was in that moment the four of them knew the law would not give them justice. If they wanted it, they would have to take it with their own hands. But they were not reckless. The Huipas were Mayan by blood, and their ancestors had taught them the value of patience. They would not charge in with machetes and rage. They would wait, watch, and plan. Revenge was not a spark to be lit quickly, it was an ember to be nursed until it burned hot enough to consume everything. And so a pact was formed, not with words, but with looks, nods, and the shared understanding of four men who had lost too much to walk away. From that day forward, every action they took had purpose. Every job they accepted, every connection they made, every rumor they listened to, all of it fed into the silent architecture of a plan. The injustice that had crushed their family had done more than break their hearts. It had reshaped them. It had turned them from boys into hunters, and once hunters take up the trail, they do not stop until the prey is found. What the killers didn't know was that their laughter, their boasting, their open display of arrogance wasn't a sign of victory. It was baiting the wrong men, because the Huipas were no longer thinking like farmers. They were thinking like predators who had been given every reason to strike. The Huipas had learned the first rule of vengeance from the jungle itself. A predator that rushes its prey often goes hungry. If they were going to act, they needed to be methodical, not impulsive. For months, the four cousins became shadows, blending into the rhythm of village life while quietly shaping a plan. To the outside world, they were still just farmers, hunters, and laborers. But beneath that mask, every move was a step toward retribution. The cousins knew their enemies' patterns, where they went to drink, which roads they traveled, even the days they liked to go hunting or check their crops. They studied them the way a jaguar studies deer, watching for weaknesses and moments of isolation. The first challenge was how to get close without raising suspicion. The killers had no reason to fear the Huipas. They believed the family had been broken by Don Aurelio's death and the law's inaction. This overconfidence was the opening the cousins needed. Isandro, with his gift for conversation, became the key. He began striking up casual talks with the men in the marketplace, offering small favors, sharing food and drink. His easy smile masked the storm in his heart. Slowly, the wall of hostility began to crumble. The killers started to see the Huipas not as enemies, but as men who had moved on. Mateo, the eldest, played the role of the humble worker. He offered his services for odd jobs, guiding hunters through the forest or transporting goods to nearby towns. It was all part of building trust. When the time came, the bait was ready. A claim that there was a hidden grove deep in the jungle filled with valuable wild cacao and rare medicinal plants resources worth a small fortune. Isandro hinted that the Huipas had discovered it and needed help transporting the goods discreetly to avoid paying taxes to the local authorities. The killer's greed did the rest. The first man agreed almost instantly. He saw easy money and perhaps even an opportunity to mock the Huipas by profiting from their supposed goodwill. The cousins suggested leaving at dawn when the jungle was still cool and the birds hadn't yet begun their morning songs. The trail they chose was no accident. It wound deep into a part of the forest the Huipas knew better than anyone, a place where the canopy was so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground, and where the cries of howler monkeys often masked other sounds. As they walked, the conversation was light, almost friendly. The killer didn't notice how the cousins subtly spread out, their positions shifting until he was surrounded. When the moment came, there were no shouts, no dramatic confrontations. It was swift, silent, and final. By the time the forest swallowed the echoes, the Huipas were already covering their tracks. The second and third targets required more patience. The cousins never struck the same way twice. They knew repetition could lead to suspicion. One was lured with the promise of guiding him to a hidden hunting ground teeming with deer. Another was offered a chance to buy a large quantity of rare timber from a friend of the Huipas, at a fraction of its worth. Each time the plan was the same: lead them into isolation, ensure no witnesses, and make sure they vanished without a trace. The jungle kept their secrets well. What made their trap so effective wasn't brute force, it was psychology. The Huipas used the very qualities their enemies prided themselves on: greed, arrogance, and overconfidence to pull them in. They made the killers believe they were in control, when in truth, every step had been guided by the cousins' hands. By the time the last man disappeared, fear had begun to creep into the village. Whispers spread of people vanishing on jungle trails. No one dared to accuse the Huipas openly. There was no proof, and besides, they still wore the mask of simple farmers. But the balance of power had shifted. Yet for the cousins, the trap was not just about taking lives. It was about restoring a sense of balance in a world where the law had failed them. Still, somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice began to question whether balance achieved through blood could ever truly heal the wounds of the past. That question would haunt them in the months to come. Because once a predator learns how easy it is to set a trap, walking away from the hunt becomes the hardest thing of all. The jungle has its own laws. In it, there are no courts, no witnesses, and no second chances. The Huipas knew this when they planned their first act of revenge, but knowing something and living it are two very different things. When they set out that morning with their first target, it still felt in some strange way like a mission for justice. The man had laughed at Don Aurelio's death, stolen his land, and walked the village streets as if murder were a badge of honor. To the cousins, he wasn't just an enemy, he was a walking reminder of their family's humiliation. The air was damp, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every sound seem louder. The five of them walked single file along a narrow path, with Mateo at the front. The man chatted casually with Isandro, boasting about a recent card game he had won, never noticing how the cousins' responses grew shorter the deeper they moved into the forest. They reached a clearing, one the cousins had chosen carefully. It was surrounded by dense undergrowth, invisible from the trail. Here, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when Mateo gave the smallest of nods. It happened fast. Lucas stepped behind the man, his hands gripping his shoulders like iron. Yari moved in from the side, and Isandro's voice, steady but cold, cut through the damp air. For Aurelio. The man barely had time to react before the jungle swallowed him. The cousins worked in grim silence, their movements precise and efficient. When it was over, there was no victory cry, no celebration, just the sound of their own breathing, ragged and uneven. In that moment, something shifted. The man's absence was immediate, almost unsettling. The space he had occupied in the world was now empty, and the cousins stood there, staring at the void they had created. The rage that had burned in their chests for years was suddenly replaced by a strange, unfamiliar quiet. It wasn't relief, it wasn't satisfaction. It was something heavier, the weight of knowing they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. On the walk back, no one spoke. The forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds seemed louder than usual, almost mocking. By the time they reached the edge of the village, they had already agreed without words. No one would ever speak of what happened, but the silence didn't make the burden lighter. That night, Yari sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He thought about the man's last look, not of fear, but of surprise. He had always imagined the first act of revenge would bring peace, that the image of Don Aurelio's bloodied body would fade from his mind. But instead, he felt something different, a dull, lingering ache and a gnawing awareness that they had stepped onto a path from which there was no return. And yet, the plan was already in motion. There were still 3 men left. 3 faces that haunted their dreams. If they stopped now, the others would still walk free, still boast in the market, still poison the air with their arrogance. Stopping wasn't an option. The next weeks blurred into a careful dance of patience and preparation. Each cousin moved through the village as if nothing had happened. They laughed when they were expected to laugh, worked when they were expected to work. But behind their eyes, the decision had been made. They had taken the first life, they would take the rest. The first act had been the hardest. Each one that followed would come easier, not because the pain was gone, but because they had already paid the cost of crossing the line. The moral walls that once stood in their way had been dismantled in a single moment, replaced by a cold, methodical resolve. This was the moment of no return, the point where justice blurred into vengeance, where survival of the spirit became indistinguishable from the destruction of the soul. The Huipas had set out to honor their uncle. But in doing so, they had stepped into a darkness that did not end where they thought it would. Because the truth about revenge is this: once you take that first step, you are no longer the same person. You can never go back to who you were before, and sometimes you don't even recognize who you've become. For a while, the Huipas believed they had restored balance. 3 of the men who had murdered Don Aurelio were gone, vanished into the jungle's silent belly. The 4th had fled the region entirely, disappearing into the mountains after hearing whispers about strange disappearances on the trails. On the surface, it looked like victory, but revenge is not a clean blade. It cuts the hand that wields it just as deeply as it cuts the target. At first, the cousins felt untouchable. No one had seen them act, no proof tied them to the disappearances. People in the village had grown quieter around them, more respectful, even cautious. It was as if their family name, once spoken in pity, now carried a shadow of fear. Yet fear is a double-edged thing. The same neighbors who once broke bread with them now kept their distance. Conversations stopped when the cousins entered the market. Invitations to weddings and celebrations quietly stopped coming. The Huipas were no longer just farmers, they were men whispered about in doorways and avoided in the streets. For Yari, the youngest, the change was the hardest to bear. The warmth of community had been part of his life since birth. Now he could feel the air shift when he walked into a room, the way people's eyes slid away rather than meet his. He had wanted justice, not isolation. Mateo, the eldest, began having trouble sleeping. He told himself it was just the humidity, the restless nights of the jungle, but deep down he knew the truth. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces, not just the faces of the men they'd taken, but Don Aurelio's too. And his uncle's eyes no longer looked at him with gratitude. They looked at him with something harder to face, disappointment. The guilt did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, like vines tightening around a tree. One evening, Isandro overheard two women at the well talking about a trader who had gone missing near the cacao groves. They didn't know it, but Isandro did. The trader had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, stumbling across one of the Huipas' operations. They had not planned to take him, but fear of exposure had forced their hand. That unintended death was a turning point. This wasn't about their uncle anymore, this was about survival, and survival was becoming harder. Rumors were spreading beyond the village. In the nearby towns, soldiers had begun asking questions about the disappearances. Patrols started to appear more frequently on the roads. A few strangers came through the village, pretending to be merchants but asking too many questions about the Huipas. The cousins tightened their circle, speaking in whispers, avoiding long trips. But the more they tried to live in the open, the more obvious their isolation became. Every decision they made now was a calculation of risk. Even simple things, buying supplies, visiting friends, became dangerous. Then came the day soldiers entered the village openly. They weren't there to search, not yet, but their presence was a warning. The captain spoke with the local elder for hours. The Huipas didn't need to be told what the conversation was about. They could feel the net tightening. That night they gathered in Mateo's home, the one with the largest fire pit. No one touched the food. They sat in silence, the weight of the past years pressing down on them. "This isn't justice anymore," Eerie finally said. "It's just killing, and we can't stop." His words hung in the air, unchallenged. They all knew he was right. The path they had chosen had no end. The moment they had crossed the line, they had set something in motion that was bigger than them, heavier than they could carry. The consequences weren't just external, they were inside each of them. Distrust, sleeplessness, that constant prickle at the back of the neck that comes from knowing someone is watching, even if you can't see them. When the arrests finally came, it was almost a relief. Soldiers arrived before dawn, moving quickly and without ceremony. There was no fight. The cousins were too tired, too hollow to resist. As they sat in the back of the truck, wrists bound, the village stared in silence. No one wept, no one spoke, and in that moment, the Huipas understood the real cost of what they had done. They had avenged their uncle, yes, but in the process, they had lost their place in the world, their peace, and their own humanity. Justice had been their goal, but revenge had been their path. And the weight of that choice was something they would carry far longer than any prison sentence. In the quiet years that followed their arrest, the Huipas' names became both a warning and a mystery. Inside the prison walls, they were no longer feared predators of the jungle. They were just four men in identical uniforms, eating the same food, sleeping in narrow bunks, their days marked by the clang of iron gates. Time moved differently there. Days bled into weeks, weeks into years, and in the silence between the routine, the lesson began to settle in. At first, they clung to the belief that what they had done was justified, that they had stepped in where the law had failed. But over time, when the adrenaline of the hunt faded and the anger cooled, they were left with the bare bones of truth. Revenge had not healed them. It had not brought Don Aurelio back. It had not erased the injustice of that night. What it had done was chain them to the very violence they despised. The four cousins saw it in different ways. Mateo, the eldest, realized it during a visit from his sister. She told him about her children, how they were growing up without his presence. He tried to smile, but inside, he felt the sting of knowing that his family was still paying for his choices. Isandro found his moment of clarity one night when he overheard another inmate boasting about a killing he'd committed. The man laughed as if life had no value, and in that laughter, Isandro heard his own voice from years before, when he'd convinced himself the ends justified the means. It was like looking into a mirror he didn't want to face. Lucas, the quiet one, began to keep a journal. He filled pages with memories of the farm, the smell of fresh maize roasting over the fire, the sound of children playing in the fields. Somewhere in those pages, he realized how far they'd drifted from the life they had loved. They had set out to protect their family's honor, but in the process, they had destroyed the peace that honor was meant to protect, and Eerie, the youngest, carried the heaviest burden. He dreamed often of the faces of those they'd taken. They were no longer just enemies in his mind. They were men with mothers, brothers, perhaps even children. The revenge that had once felt righteous now felt like a chain around his neck, pulling him into the same darkness he had hated. In prison, stories travel fast. The Huipas story became one that young inmates would ask about. At first, the cousins refused to speak of it. But eventually, they began to share not the details of the killings, but the truth of the path they had walked. "We thought revenge would make us whole," Mateo would say quietly. "It only made us smaller." They told these stories not to glorify their past, but to warn others. They spoke about the nights without sleep, the mistrust that grew between them, the way revenge had turned into a hunger that was never satisfied. In time, their tale became a kind of folk cautionary tale beyond the prison walls. Parents told their children about the Huipas not as heroes, but as men who allowed pain to turn into poison. Village elders repeated it during disputes, urging people to seek solutions before grudges grew too deep. The echo of their choices traveled farther than they ever imagined, not because of what they did, but because of the emptiness it left behind. Years later, when the cousins were old and their sentences nearly served, they spoke of one last wish: to return to the land where it all began. Not to reclaim it, but to stand there as old men and see the ceiba trees, the cornfields, and the river where they had once played as boys. They knew they couldn't undo what was done. But perhaps in those final days, they could remember a time before the blood, before the silence, before the world called them predators. The lesson that echoed from their lives was simple, but it was carved deep enough to last generations. Justice is about restoring what is broken. Revenge only shatters it further, and if you spend your life chasing retribution, you may one day find that the person you were trying to punish the most is yourself.